Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Jason once believed he had buried the past the moment Britt vanished from his life. He had convinced himself that she was gone forever, that her absence had solidified the wall he built around his heart. But deep within his mind, beneath layers of control, detachment, and silence, there existed a flicker that refused to die. It was the kind of quiet torment that he never spoke of, not even to Carly or Sam. It lingered like unfinished breath, like a moment that never got to fully exist. So when a call came through, distorted, broken, fleeting, and Britt's unmistakable voice danced through the static, something inside him cracked open. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a dream. That voice was hers. Raw. Real. Present. It cut through years of grief like a blade through fog and brought him crashing back into a reality he thought he'd buried along with the ashes of that truncated love story. The last time they had seen each other was amid chaos, deception, and sacrifice. Jason had walked into a sham marriage with Carly, not out of love, but necessity, believing he was holding Port Charles together while Sonny was presumed dead. And Britt, devastated and already hiding her Huntington's diagnosis, had disappeared, leaving behind no trace, no goodbyes, just shadows. Jason had always known she was running from more than heartbreak, but he hadn't understood the full weight of what she was escaping. Now, the truth burned behind his eyes, she was alive, but not free. And if he had any chance to rewrite what was lost, he had to act quickly. Without telling a soul, Jason followed the trail left behind by a whispered voice, a cancelled hotel booking, and a vague report from the Paris airport. Every instinct, every calculation, led him to a single destination. A secluded resort on the rocky Dalmatian coast called the Five Poppies. It was an opulent compound, outwardly serene, inwardly fortified with secrecy. Locals whispered about the place, how once you checked in, you rarely checked out. Discretion wasn't just a luxury there, it was enforced. Jason, under a fabricated identity, booked a room and began his quiet surveillance. What he uncovered shocked him to his core. Britt was indeed there, but she was not a guest, she was a captive in disguise. Though dressed in silks and guarded by smiles, Jason could see it, her confinement wrapped in civility, her autonomy stripped beneath a veil of privilege. The staff watched her too closely. She never moved without approval. And at the center of this illusion stood a man named Pascal, the resort's charming yet unyielding manager, who answered not to clients but to an invisible force Jason could not yet identify. Then came the moment that shattered illusion and made everything heartbreakingly real. As Jason spoke on the phone with Pascal, trying to maintain his cover, he heard it, Britt's voice, furious and breathless, demanding her car keys. That voice did not belong to someone under treatment or protection, it belonged to someone desperate to escape. Jason dropped the act. He left the room and moved with the precision of instinct, weaving through corridors until he saw her. Her silhouette framed by the soft resort lighting, caught in a standoff with two staff members. When their eyes met, it was not recognition. It was resurrection. The breath caught in his lungs. Britt, alive. The woman he'd mourned. The woman who had haunted every corner of his conscience. She was right there, breathing, fighting, and clearly not free. The raw mix of shock, confusion, and tentative hope in her eyes said it all. He reached for her, not as the enforcer or soldier he had once been, but as a man who knew he could not walk away this time. Not again. He guided her swiftly but gently into one of the resort's hidden service suites, a place with no cameras, no ears, and no guards. She resisted at first, unsure if she was hallucinating. But when Jason said her name in that low, gravel-edged voice only she knew, the defenses crumbled. She sank into the chair, trembling not just from relief but from the trauma she had endured in silence. The truth tumbled out in fragments. The fake death staged to escape scrutiny. The Huntington's diagnosis worsening in secret. The promise of a private medical sanctuary that became a golden cage. And the shadowy organization, whose name she never learned, that now used her as bait, or perhaps a bargaining chip, in some vast bioweapons scheme connected to Professor Dalton's arcane research. Jason listened with the steady calm of someone used to crisis but devastated by every word. He blamed himself, for not seeing the signs earlier, for choosing Carly, for letting Britt disappear when she needed him most. He stepped forward, hands trembling, and cupped her face gently. And then, he whispered 6 words that had sat buried in his chest like a ticking clock for years: "I never stopped caring about you." The words cracked something open between them. Not a romance rekindled instantly, but the possibility of a truth long denied. But they couldn't stay in that moment. Jason knew time was against them. The resort was not just a prison for Britt, it was a hub for something dangerous. He'd already intercepted coded messages between Pascal and someone referred to only as Dr. V. And there were documents, medical files with falsified test results, indicating Britt wasn't the only patient. There were others, possibly dozens, hidden in plain sight. Jason worked fast. Using Britt's room key and Pascal's schedule, he began mapping out the resort's security. He discovered a hidden elevator that led to a medical wing buried beneath the cliffside. The walls there were cold, steel-lined. Inside were sterile labs and containment rooms, some empty, others disturbingly sealed. Britt admitted she had never been allowed past the 2nd floor. Greta, her supposed caregiver, had promised treatments, but her health had steadily declined, and Jason suspected her medication had been tampered with to weaken her compliance. The deeper Jason dug, the clearer it became, this wasn't about Britt alone. This was a test site. A nexus of biotech experimentation masquerading as convalescence. Pascal wasn't just a manager. He was an operative. And the man referred to as Dr. V, Jason feared, might have ties to what remained of WSB's splinter cell operations. Worse, Jason's presence had triggered something. Surveillance had intensified. Staff behavior turned erratic. They knew someone was onto them. He planned the escape meticulously. A backup power generator sat beneath the old spa. If he could detonate a small EMP burst, he might disable the cameras and security doors for just long enough to get Britt out. But they had to act fast. Her health was waning, and every minute she stayed was another tether the facility wrapped around her. On the night of the planned escape, a storm blew in from the Adriatic, shaking the compound's foundations. Under cover of lightning and chaos, Jason lifted Britt into his arms. She was weak, but conscious, her fingers gripping his jacket like lifelines. They moved through the underbelly of the resort, service tunnels, maintenance shafts, and into the generator room. With practiced hands, Jason activated the EMP, and as the lights flickered and doors unlocked, they raced toward the harbor. A small boat, moored by a fisherman Jason had bribed earlier that day, waited like a ghost in the storm. They collapsed onto it as alarms blared behind them, their escape sealed by the crashing waves and gunfire echoing in the distance. As they drifted into the darkness, Britt curled into Jason's arms. She was broken, but alive. He held her close, whispering again the only truth that mattered, that he would never let her go. Not this time. Because for the first time in years, Jason Morgan didn't just have something to protect, he had someone to come back to. And that made all the difference. Meanwhile, across the sprawling and deceptive tranquility of the Five Poppies resort, Jocelyn and Vaughn, operating under the identities of a newlywed couple, were carefully and methodically working their way into the inner machinery of the facility. Their mission was clear: uncover the truth behind the resort's increasingly suspicious activities under the guise of a luxury health retreat. Armed with cover identities, wedding rings, and fabricated backstories, they blended into the resort's elite clientele while discreetly gathering intel. Neither of them, however, had any idea that Jason was already on site, or that he had located Britt and uncovered just how deep and sinister the deception ran. The separation of their missions was unintentional, but it wouldn't remain so for long. The fates of all three were destined to collide under the same web of secrets and surveillance that the Five Poppies had so expertly spun. Jason, meanwhile, was operating in the shadows, constantly one step ahead but increasingly under pressure. Pascal, the resort's enigmatic manager, had begun to sense something was off. Jason's questions, his movements, his subdued manner, nothing matched the profile of a typical guest. Pascal began reviewing security footage more frequently, and to Jason's dismay, several cameras had already been repositioned to better monitor the hallway leading to Britt's room. Worse, he spotted a tiny flashing red indicator embedded in the corner of her suite, a hidden recording device. Someone was tracking her every move. It confirmed his worst fear: Britt wasn't simply a protected patient. She was being observed, managed, and most likely controlled for purposes far beyond wellness or care. The resort was merely a facade for a clandestine operation, and whatever its mission, Britt was now its unwilling centerpiece. The implications were harrowing. Jason quickly deduced that Five Poppies was more than just a glorified prison. It operated as a covert research and behavioral manipulation facility. Possibly tied to remnants of WSB's rogue elements or an entirely new organization born from its ashes. There were signs everywhere once he began to look through the right lens: biometric scanners on inconspicuous doors, soundproof chambers passed off as detox spas, and medical staff who changed identities more frequently than their uniforms. There were codewwords in staff chatter, encrypted messages being routed through the guest Wi-Fi, and subtle drug dispersal systems embedded in water coolers and food trays. The scope was terrifying. This wasn't care. This was control. What terrified Jason more was the possibility that Britt, under the influence of medication and emotional isolation, had become a part of their experiments without her knowledge. Her declining health wasn't entirely due to Huntington's. He now suspected it was being chemically accelerated to create compliance. Her treatments weren't aiding her. They were weakening her resolve, damaging her neurology, and quietly tethering her to the walls of the resort. Every dose, every pill, was a chain. And the most insidious truth was this: she wasn't alone. While secretly searching Pascal's locked office during a rare lapse in guard rotation, Jason uncovered falsified medical records, lab entries with forged signatures, and a hidden server containing biometric data for at least 16 other women, all with similar diagnoses, all showing identical patterns of deterioration, and all reported as voluntary patients. Most disturbing was a set of digital files labeled Erasure Protocol, Tier 3, which detailed methods of identity suppression using a combination of sedatives, memory inhibitors, and staged social withdrawal techniques. Britt's file was at the top of the list. It noted the date of her fake death, the Paris airport incident, and behavioral observations taken at regular intervals under a category titled Subject Drift. She wasn't just a patient. She was a case study. She was being erased. Realizing the full breadth of the operation, Jason knew that time was no longer a luxury. Britt's physical and psychological condition was rapidly deteriorating. Every hour she remained within those walls increased the risk that she would pass the threshold of no return, where even escape wouldn't be enough to bring her back to herself. He had to act. But escape was no longer as simple as sneaking out through a service door. The facility was locked down through biometric checkpoints, and the only plausible exit route led through an underground tunnel that passed beneath the spa and out toward the base of the cliffs, where a private boat could dock unseen. The tunnel was sealed behind a steel gate with an access code Jason didn't yet have. To get that code, he would need to gain full access to Pascal's encrypted control console. Risking exposure, Jason broke into Pascal's office a second time, this time downloading all surveillance feeds from the last 72 hours. While parsing through the footage, he saw something that chilled his blood, a feed of Britt's room from a hidden angle behind a mirror, capturing her vulnerable, drugged moments meant to be private. It was evidence of psychological violation, of institutional cruelty masked as medical supervision. He transferred the files to a portable drive, not just to aid in escape, but as proof. This place needed to be brought down. With the digital codes finally in hand, Jason returned to Britt, who had grown weaker but now trusted him completely. He gave her a final injection of a metabolic booster he found in the restricted medical cabinet, a risk, but a necessary one to help her through the grueling escape ahead. He wrapped her in layers of thermal blankets, fastened her wrists gently to his own with reinforced cord in case she lost consciousness, and prepared for the final push through the bowels of the resort. But unknown to him, Jocelyn and Vaughn were already deep in the operation, preparing to gain access to the same tunnel from the opposite side. Disguised as guests participating in a nighttime beach excursion, they planned to breach the supply hallway that fed into the tunnel's base. The overlap was dangerous. If they were caught, the alarms would blow Jason's entire operation. And worse, if they encountered each other without recognition, it could end in chaos or tragedy. Still, Jason moved. Each step through the tunnel was calculated. He carried Britt when she faltered, spoke quietly into her ear to keep her awake, and pushed forward even as the air grew damper, the tunnel colder, and the sound of moving guards echoed behind them. But he didn't stop. Not when they reached the final security door. Not when the power flickered. Not even when he heard movement ahead and saw two silhouettes, armed and unknown. Because in that moment, only one thing mattered: Britt Westbourne had to survive. Not just escape, but survive, remember, and reclaim the life that had been systematically stripped away from her by those who treated her like data, not a woman. And Jason Morgan, stoic, broken, relentless, had made a silent vow that he would not leave that cursed compound without her, even if it meant going to war with the ghosts of the WSB itself. On a night drenched in darkness, the skies above the Dalmatian coast churned with fury. The storm that had been forecasted for days finally descended like a divine reckoning, cloaking the Five Poppies resort in sheets of rain and roaring wind. Lightning split the horizon with violent flashes, momentarily illuminating the cliffs and battered rooftops, while thunder cracked so loud it seemed to rattle the foundations of the earth itself. For most, it was a night of shelter and fear. But for Jason Morgan, it was the moment he had been waiting for, the perfect cover for escape. The electrical interference from the storm began disrupting the resort's power grid just as Jason predicted. Lights flickered across hallways, control panels glitched, and security feeds suffered seconds-long blackouts that would have triggered full lockdown under normal conditions. But chaos has its own kind of rhythm. And Jason, ever the strategist, had studied it long enough to find the beat. He had no more time to wait. Britt was deteriorating fast, her breath shallow, her body weakened by chemical dependence and emotional trauma. Yet her will, though bruised, had not broken. And that was all Jason needed. Bundled in a hooded cloak, her limbs trembling and skin pale, Britt clung to Jason's side as they navigated the winding inner corridors of the resort. Each step was a gamble, each turn a new danger. When they reached the secured entrance of the tunnel beneath the spa, Jason typed in the stolen code with practiced urgency. A single red light blinked. Then green. The heavy steel door groaned open. But just as they crossed the threshold into the damp, narrow corridor that led to freedom, Britt collapsed. Her body convulsed violently, her muscles seizing in unpredictable spasms. Jason caught her before she hit the ground, his arms cradling her limp form as her breathing quickened and her eyes rolled back. She was going into withdrawal, far more rapidly than he had feared. For a split second, panic clawed at him. But Jason didn't let it take root. He reached into his backpack, retrieved an emergency vial of the only medication he had salvaged, and injected it into her arm with the precision of someone who performed battlefield triage more times than he could count. Her convulsions slowed, but the damage had been done. Britt was conscious but barely. Her strength was failing, and the tunnel stretched ahead like a narrow abyss. And then came the noise, footsteps. Heavy. Rushed. Armed. Two resort enforcers burst into the tunnel, flashlights cutting through the shadows. Jason swung Britt behind a concrete pillar, crouched low, and pulled his sidearm. Silencers kept the gunfire low, but the tension rang louder than any bullet. One guard went down instantly. The other fired back, grazing Jason's arm before disappearing into the dark. Jason didn't chase. He knew reinforcements would come. Time was bleeding out as fast as the storm outside was flooding the coast. He turned to Britt. She looked at him through bleary, half-lidded eyes, her lips parting in an apology she couldn't voice. And that was when Jason spoke, not with anger, not with fear, but with unflinching promise. "If you can't walk, I'll carry you." And he did. Lifting her into his arms, Jason stepped into the tunnel's final leg, each footfall slow, deliberate, dangerous. Water leaked from above, forming slick patches across the uneven stone. Rats scurried. The walls narrowed. But Jason pressed forward, the weight of Britt in his arms both a burden and a vow. Every breath she took reminded him of why he had come. Not for duty. Not for redemption. But for her. The tunnel opened at last into a jagged cliffside exit overlooking a hidden cove. Below, waves crashed with primal fury against rocks slick with salt and storm water. A small fishing vessel bobbed violently in the current, anchored just enough to stay moored but barely. Jason knew they only had moments. He climbed down the narrow path cut into the rock face, shielding Britt with his body, his boots slipping on the wet stone. Wind whipped across his face like razors, but he did not falter. Lightning struck again as he reached the boat. The fisherman, wide-eyed with fear and confusion, offered a trembling hand. Jason ignored it. He lowered Britt onto the deck himself, wrapped her in tarpaulins, and secured her beneath the small cabin. The boat lurched. Gunfire cracked from behind. Jason ducked just as a bullet split the air where his head had been. He fired back, not to kill, but to buy seconds. The fisherman hit the engine. It sputtered. Then roared. And they were off.